Some people peak early in life, and then there are people who grow up feeling completely out of sync with everyone around them. Like everyone else received a map for life, except them. You watch people your age move through life more easily than you. Meanwhile, your personality keeps rebuilding itself in secret. Eventually, a terrifying thought starts following you everywhere. What if I'm just falling behind? The people who feel this the deepest are often the ones who transform the most later in life. Not because they suddenly become smarter, not because they magically gain confidence, but because certain personalities were never designed to fully belong to the first half of life. Carl Jung believed that some minds don't truly arrive until much later, which explains why some people spend their 20s feeling lost and disconnected from themselves, only to become unexpectedly powerful once everyone else starts emotionally collapsing. That transformation usually begins right after they stop trying to be emotionally acceptable to everyone around them. That's when people start reacting differently to them, less comfortable, because some relationships survive on your self-doubt. And if that sentence hits something inside you, this video might explain your entire life. There's a specific kind of loneliness that comes from realizing you've never moved at the same rhythm as other people. Even as a kid, you felt things too deeply and thought too much before speaking. People called you mature or difficult to understand. Eventually, you learned something dangerous. Being fully yourself confused people. Sometimes it even intimidated them. So, you adapted. You became socially acceptable instead of emotionally honest. You typed honest messages, then deleted them before sending. You replayed tiny social moments in bed at 2 a.m. wondering if you sounded strange. You became hyper-aware of other people while disconnecting from yourself. After years of doing this, something strange happens. You no longer know whether people like you or the version of you that learned how to survive them. And that's usually where the real damage starts. Because once your personality becomes survival-based, you begin abandoning yourself automatically. That's why some personalities become exhausted so early in life. Not because they're weak, because they've been shape-shifting since childhood. Most people don't realize how psychologically draining it is to constantly monitor yourself while existing around others. To reread a text message 5 times before sending it. To regret being emotionally honest 30 seconds later. To feel your nervous system tighten the moment someone's energy changes slightly towards you. People call it overthinking. But most of the time, you're not overthinking. You're detecting emotional inconsistencies other people ignore. The moment someone becomes colder, once you stop shrinking yourself. After years of noticing things this deeply, your brain stops relaxing around people entirely. That's why these personalities often bloom later, because early life rewards social conformity, but later life rewards psychological depth. And that's usually the moment their lives quietly start separating from everyone else's. When you're younger, the world rewards fast confidence, fast success, and socially acceptable identities. But some personalities require years to understand themselves. While everyone else is busy building external identities, they're silently building internal identities. That process looks invisible from the outside, which is why they often feel like failures for years, especially in their 20s. Your 20s can feel brutal when you're this kind of person. People are getting married, building careers, and posting photos that make their lives look complete. Meanwhile, you're sitting alone at 1:12 a.m. staring at the ceiling, wondering why every version of success feels emotionally wrong when you imagine yourself inside it. You watch people celebrating lives you secretly know would destroy you emotionally, because nobody talks about it honestly. Sometimes the reason you feel lost isn't because you have no direction. It's because your personality refuses to build a life that disconnects you from yourself, and that creates painful delay. You'll watch people surpass you in ways that make you question your entire timeline. But years later, many of those same people begin emotionally unraveling, quietly, because they built identities too quickly, lives they never emotionally examined, relationships based on performance instead of truth, careers built around approval instead of meaning. And suddenly the person who looked behind starts becoming emotionally stable in ways nobody expected, because some personalities age into power instead of popularity. That's the part people rarely understand about late bloomers. The bloom looks sudden, but the roots were growing underground for years. Carl Jung believed that the first half of life is often about adaptation, learning how to survive society. But the second half of life becomes something else entirely, returning to yourself. Some personalities are unconsciously preparing for that return much earlier than others. That's why you may have always felt emotionally older than your age in certain ways, but emotionally younger in others. You understood sadness and human behavior too early. You noticed emotional tension other people ignored. But certainty, belonging, identity, those took longer. Because your mind wasn't built for shallow attachment to identity. It needed truth first. And truth takes time. Especially for people who spend most of their lives observing instead of performing. You can usually recognize these people by one strange trait. Surface-level social environments exhausted you. Not because you hate people, because your nervous system is searching for emotional authenticity. And when it can't find it, you mentally disappear. You've probably done this before. You respond normally while mentally disappearing from the interaction. Like your real self left the room. The frightening part? Most people never notice. Because you became good at performing normal. That emotional detachment becomes stronger with age, especially after repeated disappointment, especially after realizing how many social interactions are performance-based. At some point, these personalities stop craving attention. They start craving resonance. Someone who understands them without requiring performance. Someone emotionally calm. Someone real. And this is often where their lives begin changing. Because once deeply self-aware people stop chasing external validation, they become incredibly difficult to manipulate. That's a dangerous level of emotional freedom, and not everyone reacts well to it. Some people only liked you when you were emotionally uncertain, when you abandoned yourself to keep the relationship stable. But the moment you stop shrinking yourself, certain relationships start collapsing almost immediately. And that wasn't even the most painful part. The painful part is realizing how many people were connected to your self-abandonment, not your real personality. But people who feel emotionally misunderstood long enough eventually stop expecting approval altogether. And when that happens, their personality starts consolidating. You stop shrinking yourself to keep emotionally shallow people comfortable. There's another reason these personalities succeed later. Pain gave them psychological depth. Other people postpone developing. When your early life feels emotionally isolating, you're forced into self-reflection earlier than most people. You start recognizing emotional patterns and manipulation earlier than most people. That awareness feels like a curse when you're young, especially because nobody explains what's happening to you. You weren't emotionally weak. You were emotionally overstimulated. You thought you lacked confidence, but you were actually disconnected from environments that drained your identity. Once you realize that, your entire past starts looking different. Because some emotionally deep people were never broken. They were psychologically surrounded by the wrong people for too long. But later in life, that same awareness becomes wisdom. And wisdom ages differently than charisma. Charisma peaks early. Wisdom compounds. That's why some people become more attractive as they age. Their presence becomes calmer and sharper. Calmer in a way that makes manipulative people uncomfortable. Less desperate for validation. They stop trying to dominate rooms and start changing the emotional atmosphere without effort. You feel safe around them without fully understanding why. Many of these people spent their younger years believing something was fundamentally wrong with them, because nobody tells emotionally complex people an important truth early enough. Your sensitivity was never the weakness. Your lack of self-trust was. Once those two things separate, everything starts changing faster than expected. You stop viewing your depth as damage. You stop forcing yourself to become emotionally simpler just to fit into environments that were never built for you. Suddenly, your entire past starts making sense. You were developing internally while everyone else was developing externally. And external development is louder, so it looks more successful at first. But eventually, life becomes psychological. And this is where most people quietly fall apart. At a certain age, social masks stop working. People begin confronting themselves. The performance cracks. And many people realize they built entire identities around avoiding who they actually are. That realization destroys them. But for certain personalities, it becomes liberation. Because they've already spent years confronting themselves in silence. They already know what it means to rebuild themselves internally. That experience becomes emotional resilience later. Not perfect happiness. Not some fantasy version of enlightenment. Just a quieter kind of strength. The kind that doesn't panic during identity collapse. The kind that no longer needs constant noise to avoid inner emptiness. That's rarer than talent. You can see it in certain people's eyes as they get older. Not arrogance, not superiority, just self-possession. Like they've finally stopped running from themselves. That's why some personalities become magnetic later in life. Not because they learned how to impress people, because they stopped trying to. The validation and endless proving start feeling emotionally cheap. They become more selective, more intentional, more protective of their energy. And yes, sometimes lonelier. But it's a different kind of loneliness now. Not the loneliness of feeling unseen, the loneliness of realizing you can no longer emotionally tolerate shallow connection. Once that realization happens, your entire future starts changing. Because once you experience real alignment with yourself, performing a fake life becomes unbearable. That's why many late bloomers suddenly make drastic changes later in life. They leave relationships that looked fine. They change careers unexpectedly. They disappear from social circles. They move cities. They rebuild everything. And people around them get confused. What happened to you? But internally, it feels less like becoming someone new, and more like finally becoming impossible to abandon. Carl Jung once wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is becoming who you truly are. But becoming who you truly are is not a smooth process, especially for emotionally deep personalities. It's messy, lonely, and deeply disorienting. Sometimes it feels like your entire life is happening later than everyone else's. But maybe your timeline was never wrong. Maybe your personality needed depth before direction. Maybe the reason you've always felt different is because you were never meant to bloom during the stage of life that rewards imitation. Some people peak when the world rewards performance. Others peak when life starts demanding truth. And those are very different things. So if you've spent years feeling behind, quietly exhausted from trying to fit into lives that never felt fully yours, maybe your story isn't late. Maybe it's just deeper than most people can see right now. And maybe one day, the very traits that made you feel isolated will become the exact traits that make you emotionally unshakable later in life.